Lisa the Iconoclast is the 16th episode of the 7th season of The Simpsons. As the bicentennial for the town of Springfield approaches, Lisa Simpson visits a local museum dedicated to the history of the town founder, Jebediah Springfield. The historian Hollis Hurlbut teaches Lisa about the greatness of Jebediah, who famously tamed the wild buffalo, led settlers from Maryland to a new land, and founded the town they know and love today. While Mr. Hurlbut is in the other room, Lisa discovers a secret confession hidden inside Jebediah's fife. She learns that Jebediah Springfield's real name was Hans Sprungfeld, that he never tamed the wild buffalo, and that he was actually a pirate who had no love for the people of the town whatsoever. Her further research shows that Jebediah once tried to assassinate President George Washington in the midst of a botched robbery. Lisa's mother, Marge, does not believe her, nor does anyone else in town, including Mr. Hurlbut. Lisa's father, Homer, does believe her and tries to help her convince the town. In the end, she finally has irrefutable proof of the true identity of Jebediah, but at the last moment, she opts not to inform the town during the bicentennial parade, concluding that the myth of Jebediah Springfield brings out the best in people, and that this ignorance actually has greater value than the truth. There is a happy ending, Lisa and Homer march in the parade, and all is well in Springfield once more. Although the episode is specifically about the fictional town of Springfield, Lisa's speech about historical mythology being an unassailable good is questionable. Broadening the scope of historical mythology to myths about the United States, we see that these myths have a negative impact not only on our understanding of history, but on policy and attitudes about the United States to this day. Patriotism does not always bring out the best in people, and its related cousin, nationalism, can bring out the worst. Philosopher and psychologist Rollo May once said, "A myth is a way of making sense in a senseless world. Myths are narrative patterns that give significance to our existence." That is more or less what Lisa Simpson is saying, but myth can be more than that, and it's important to draw a distinction between myth as propaganda and myth as ideology. An etiological myth is a story that explains something that is contemporaneously unexplainable, such as ancient Greek myths about the changing seasons. Myth as propaganda, however, intentionally replaces facts, replaces history, and becomes more akin to misinformation than a tall tale or harmless fable. American myths are very much myths as propaganda. While America is a continent, not a country, I'll be using the naming convention of shortening the United States of America to America and U.S. Americans as Americans here. Nobody needs to Lisa Simpson me about naming conventions that I did not invent and cannot change. American mythology begins with Christopher Columbus and his arrival in the Americas. This sets discovery as a key foundational aspect of what it means to be American, which in turn comes to justify colonization and westward expansion as destiny rather than choice, obfuscating responsibility for the consequences. Columbus, though from a foreign land, is adopted by Americans and inserted into American mythology as its foundational mythological figure. In the very beginning of a letter sent back to Spain upon his arrival in the New World, Columbus describes how by his mere presence he has declared possession of land by bringing the native population under Spanish colonial rule. "I discovered a great many islands inhabited by numberless people, and of all I have taken possession for their highnesses by proclamation and display of the royal standard without opposition." Without opposition. Let's look into that. When Columbus declared the land his, who among the indigenous people present could understand his language and what was going on, let alone speak opposition that Columbus would have understood? Columbus's justification is that no one opposed his claim and that any rights were therefore forfeited. By dismissing the indigenous people as primitive, Columbus justified his later actions. By renaming the lands and the people who inhabited them, Columbus positioned himself as the only authority and therefore the author of his own story, his own myth. Historian Heike Paul, author of The Myths That Made America, explained it thusly: "Translating, naming, and classifying are operations that are part of the process of colonization, and intricate parts of the process of othering, i.e., of turning the native population into the other, and the object of European rule. In Columbus's description of the New World inhabitants, there is a clear dichotomy of us, the Europeans, versus them, the native population, at work. Both groups are portrayed as fundamentally and irreconcilably different from each other. This extreme polarization, what Hartog describes as the excluded middle, is another ingredient in the rhetoric of otherness that produces unabridgable difference, introduces a steep hierarchy between us and them, and thus legitimizes asymmetrical power relations. American mythology related to Columbus resembles an ideological creation myth, but the intention of the myth was not to explain something that was contemporaneously unexplainable. Instead, it was a myth as propaganda, initially for the Spanish royalty to prove that his voyage was a success and could see a return on the investment, but later the myth helped solidify discovery as an inherently American attribute. The consequence of mythologizing Columbus's discovery is that if discovery is wholly American, then whatever Columbus did to the indigenous people was in service of discovery and therefore American. This is why contradicting the Columbus myth produces an opposition based in nationalism. Historical criticism, even dispassionate historical investigation into Columbus, provokes defensive cries from Americans that if not for Columbus there would be no America, and we should all just shut up and not reconsider our nation's past, and if we don't like it, well, we can just go to Russia or something. Love it or leave it. In the aforementioned episode, Lisa the Iconoclast, when Lisa attempts to expose Jebediah Springfield for his crimes, Apu knowingly asks her not to do so in his store, largely out of fear. He knows that contradicting American mythology is seen as un-American, and as an immigrant he will be subject to greater scrutiny and oppression than Lisa would.
Take that down. As a semi-legal immigrant, your poster could land me in a predicament as red-hot as the candies which bear that name.
Because of Columbus's position as the foundational mythological figure in America, criticism of Columbus is viewed as un-American, in spite of the fact that Columbus himself was not American. Despite this, Columbus is inextricably linked with America, mythologized in many ways. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, author of An Indigenous People's History of the United States, gives a few examples. The Columbus myth suggests that from U.S. independence onward, colonial settlers saw themselves as part of a world system of colonization. Columbia, the poetic Latinate name used in reference to the United States from its founding throughout the 19th century, was based on the name of Christopher Columbus. The land of Columbus was and still is represented by the image of a woman in sculptures and paintings, by institutions such as Columbia University, and by countless place names, including that of the national capital, the District of Columbia. The 1798 hymn, Hail Columbia, was the early national anthem and is now used whenever the Vice President of the United States makes a public appearance, and Columbus Day is still a federal holiday despite Columbus never having set foot on the continent claimed by the United States. Children are taught about Columbus discovering America in school, and unless they look into it further, that is what they believe for the rest of their lives.
What was Christopher Columbus actually looking for when he discovered America?
Christopher Columbus initiated the two greatest crimes in the history of the Western Hemisphere, the Atlantic slave trade and the Native American genocide. Among his most notable crimes, Columbus ordered 1,500 men and women seized, eventually letting 400 go, condemning 500 to be sent to Spain and another 600 to be enslaved by Spanish men remaining on the island. Approximately 200 of the 500 sent to Spain died on the voyage, and were thrown overboard by the Spanish. Historians estimate that there were about 300,000 inhabitants of Hispaniola in 1492. Between 1494 and 1496, 100,000 died, half due to mass suicide rather than to be enslaved by Columbus. By 1548, it was estimated to be only 500 left. These facts are irrefutable and widely understood by historians across the world. Nevertheless, referencing these facts provokes a severe defensive reaction from Americans, calling Columbus a hero and offering no consideration for everything else he did.
Homer, I support most any prejudice you can name, but your hero-phobia sickens me.
Columbus wrote his own myth, and it continued long after his death. There is no secret confession of Columbus the way there is with Jebediah Springfield. Quite the opposite. It is Columbus's own writings that his defenders and mythmakers use to glorify him and subsequently glorify America. 19th century historian Aaron Goodrich, in his book A History of the Character and Achievements of the So-Called Christopher Columbus, wrote the following. We are constantly told that the weight of authority is on the side of Columbus, but how can the ardent seeker of truth, and truth only, fail to be discouraged when he finds how partial is the testimony in the case? Columbus thus becomes his own historian and eulogist, laying down the law by which the claims of all others are to be judged. He would naturally present his own side of the case, and from what his writings led us to suppose, would not scruple to slander those whose opinions or statements differ from his, or who had opposed any of his measures. Consequences of mythologizing discovery and expansion as indisputable American attributes include hundreds of years of trampling Native American rights, from various conflicts and forced relocation to incidents in modern times like the Dakota Pipeline. If this were happening, say, in the middle of Dallas or Boston, we would be outraged, but centuries of mythologizing about the founding of America, much of which contains othering the indigenous people, has much of America think of this concern as something unrelated to real America, but instead the unfortunate happenstance of a race apart, rather than the consequences of hundreds of years of propaganda and anti-historical cultural myths. In the 8th episode of the first season of The Simpsons, The Telltale Head, Bart meets some new friends, the worst kids in school. After a day of sneaking into movies and shoplifting, Bart and his cohorts look at images in the clouds. Bart sees the statue of Jebediah Springfield without its head. Jimbo remarks that it would be funny if someone cut off the head of the statue. Bart, hoping to impress his new friends, sneaks out in the middle of the night and saws off the head. The town is in mourning. Nobody has been hurt and nobody has lost their life, but the fact that the statue of the town's founder has been vandalized has crushed the spirits of everyone in Springfield. Bart eventually confesses his crime to his family, and on the way back to return the head, the townspeople discover what happened and attempt to lynch a 10-year-old boy. Bart, having learned his lesson, returns the head, and he and Homer walk away unscathed. Although vandalism is far from a capital offense, the people of Springfield firmly believed it was their duty to execute anyone who defiled the memory of their founding father. Jebediah is revered locally, much as the founding fathers of the United States of America are revered nationally. According to the aforementioned book, The Myths That Made America, the myth of the Founding Fathers constitutes an American master narrative which has enshrined a group of statesmen and politicians of the Revolutionary and post-Revolutionary period as personifications of the origin of American nationhood, republicanism, and democratic culture. The Founding Fathers epitomize a political myth of origin that is phrased in a language of kinship. The term fathers suggests tradition, legitimacy, and paternity, and creates an allegory of family and affiliation that affirms the union and the cohesion of the new nation. Who counts as a founding father is debatable. The people who signed the Declaration of Independence, perhaps, or those who had a hand in the United States Constitution, or both. Certainly the early presidents, at least. The Founding Fathers is a myth that claims that the United States evolved from the Puritans' Mayflower Compact to the political maturity of a representative republic. If Columbus resembles a creation myth, the Founding Fathers are a post-flood recreation myth. A new beginning through the American Revolution. The mythologized Founding Fathers symbolize cooperation. These fathers all working toward one goal. The myth tones down internal conflicts among these fathers, erasing their plans, their interests, their disagreements. They form a collective in the myth, a singular political entity. The myth also strongly personalizes the origins of the United States and its representative republic by presenting them as the result of the political genius, virtue, and audacity of history's great men. This personalization breeds a kind of unearned familiarity with the Founding Fathers. When Springfield's founder is attacked through vandalism, the town takes it personally. This is not only an attack on a statue, itself centered around a myth of Jebediah Springfield killing a bear. No, it's an attack on themselves due to this unearned familiarity. One man almost always included in conversations and lists about founding fathers is President George Washington. Mythology about Washington was that he could not tell a lie and that he famously fought for liberty, but even a cursory examination of Washington shows him to have been a deeply deceptive figure, as well as someone who denied the liberty of others. When Washington was 11 years old, he inherited 10 slaves from his father's estate. But lest one think this was something only thrust upon him, throughout his life he continued to acquire slaves, some more through inheritance and others through his own direct purchases. In 1759, he married the wealthy widow Martha Dandridge Custis, bringing in over 80 more slaves to the estate at Mount Vernon, bringing his total to almost 150 slaves. Washington used slave labor to maintain his wealth, his lifestyle, and his reputation. As he aged, he considered ridding himself of his slaves, as he famously wrote in 1778, but he never did. According to New York Times journalist Erica Armstrong Dunbar, President Washington actually went to great lengths to maintain his ownership of his slaves. During the president's 2 terms in office, the Washingtons relocated first to New York and then to Philadelphia. Although slavery had steadily declined in the North, the Washingtons decided that they could not live without it. Once settled in Philadelphia, Washington encountered his first roadblock to slave ownership in the region, Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. The act began dismantling slavery, eventually releasing people from bondage after their 28th birthdays. Under the law, any slave who entered Pennsylvania with an owner and lived in the state for longer than 6 months would be set free automatically. This presented a problem for the new president. Washington developed a canny strategy that would protect his property and allow him to avoid public scrutiny. Every 6 months, the president's slaves would travel back to Mount Vernon or would journey with Mrs. Washington outside the boundaries of the state. In essence, the Washingtons reset the clock. Washington supported policies that protected slave owners. In 1793, Washington signed the first Fugitive Slave Law, which allowed fugitives to be seized in any state, tried and returned to their owners. Anyone who harbored or assisted a fugitive faced a $500 penalty and possible imprisonment. In 1796, Ona Judge, the Washingtons' 22-year-old slave woman, escaped from Philadelphia. President Washington and his agents pursued Judge for 3 years, but she managed to avoid recapture for the remainder of her life. Should you mention that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin owned slaves, and at least in one case did something a lot worse than just owning the slave, the nationalism ignites in the hearts of many Americans, and their figurative pitchforks and torches are brandished. Bad arguments like, "It was a different time, and that's just what people did back then," ignore the contributions of abolitionist activists in that period, and the fact that by the time the United States abolished slavery, it was already abolished in much of the Western world, making the U.S. a real Johnny-come-lately in the great experiment in treating people like human beings. It also ignores the fact that owning slaves, like all exploitation to this day, was predominantly the domain of the wealthy, and that the vast majority of Americans did not own slaves. But the Founding Fathers? Oh yes, quite a few did. The consequences of mythologizing these men and obfuscating their crimes with propaganda are numerous. For one, it glorifies traditionalism, which has the byproduct of political conservatism and even reactionary politics. For another, it helps hide how the effects of slavery are still being felt today due to generational wealth. The descendants of slave owners profit from that inherited wealth and are therefore born into the upper class, and the descendants of slaves, having far less or no generational wealth, are born into poverty. For another still, mythologizing the Founding Fathers as great men is an argument for constitutional constructionism, a position of seeing the United States Constitution as a perfect document that can only be interpreted literally and within the confines of the time it was written. This argument is commonly used by conservative judges and Supreme Court justices. No new rights or privileges can be awarded under a strict constructionist interpretation. For yet another still, mythologizing and deifying the Founding Fathers leads to the legitimization of the comically ridiculous argument of what would the Founding Fathers think when confronted with marginalized people gaining new rights and considerations under the law. Whenever there is progress, someone says, "What would the Founding Fathers think of this?" And everyone is forced to pretend this is a real argument, or else be labeled un-American. Returning to Lisa the Iconoclast, and Lisa's speech at the end, is Springfield really better off ignorantly believing that Jebediah Springfield was a great hero? Has his myth really brought out the best in everyone? The lesson Lisa is meant to learn in this Frank Capra-style ending is that even though she finds freedom in the truth, others might not. And that's a fair bit of knowledge itself, except that ignorance and mythology about the past often limits the freedom of many people. It is something to keep people less free. Coddling Americans about what the United States really was and really is does a disservice to the people who are harmed by this ignorance. Lisa doesn't want to hurt the feelings of Americans, but what about the feelings of those who suffer because of this mythology? The parade is filled with soldiers whose pride is intertwined with that of Jebediah Springfield. National mythology and an unearned feeling of righteousness allows conflicts to rage across the world, unprotested by a people who assume their people must be the good guys. Their mythology tells them so. The episode chastises Lisa in the end for being, well, a spoilsport, and has her change her mind to let the audience know the message of the story. But Lisa was right in the first place, before she changed her mind. A community is not better for deifying their leaders, their founders, mythologizing their past. It's propaganda that is time and time again used for political goals, often against marginalized people. Your comfort is not more important than the truth if the lie is weaponized to hurt people. Maybe if you see America only as a series of parades, nobody is being harmed, and on that day, all is well. But what about every other day?
Behold, the last Butterfinger in the whole house, and I have it. Dad says no teasing. Na-na-na-na-na-na. Whoa! Check out the smooth, chocolatey outside, the crispity, crunchity, peanut buttery inside. Dad says if you make a scream, you're dead meat. You wouldn't scream. Dad!